For staff who are still here, sincere thanks and appreciation. The rest of the commissioners will be back in just a moment. They were stopping by the office on the way back down, so we'll be able to reconvene momentarily. So we could actually go through and do some cleanup on some of these then. No, I don't have the back.
It's up to you, you tell me.
I'll call him. Yeah, I better remind myself. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I think this is a good discussion, just to get things cleaned up, reviewed, looked at. All right, we have 2 more to go.
Hello?
That's the camera directly across.
Hello? Yeah.
That's right.
Yes. All right, bye.
Just sitting out here hanging out.
Hanging out with the guys.
Doug didn't offer you pizza, there's pizza upstairs, see?
No,
That's me getting you in trouble.
I almost headed down to Fritz.
There is pizza upstairs, I think.
Oh, it's keeps me hungry, so to speak.
My whole schedule is off today. I was eating lunch, supposed to eat lunch with Angela and June, but I had just eaten brunch, so then I wasn't ready at lunch.
Yeah.
And then you get hungry at 3.
Yeah.
And then I came to dinner and I couldn't eat dinner. You're just off by a little bit.
Marriage still works for family.
And it smelled so good. She's coming, she just said you had to run the restroom.
Oh, okay. Well, in the spirit of a discussion, we'll just wait till she returns.
It's kind of, they took the time to do it. She probably should hear it.
Yeah. It is.
Turner Hills, that goes all the way back to 2006. I guess that was on the planning and zoning. I guess that was in planning and zoning at that time, because I remember coming forward, I thought it was.
more fun, I should say.
No, you can call them, you can preserve the board for the, you can finish.
Yeah, we could just leave it
Take a
there.
picture of it, you can
Yeah.
see where everything is.
When you see him again, you have to say, so, Mr. Apple. He'll be like,
Come on.
David.
That's right. And he's not doing cat or dog either. Yeah. All right, we are all back from special session, and so we will reconvene this meeting right before we adjourned for the special session. Mr. Levin had just gone through some points from his perspective on the finances, and I see that we do have the TIF district map up now, and so staff can continue the presentation.
Well, Commissioners, we put together this TIF map of all the existing TIFs. The asterisk like Turtle Hill number 28 will show that it's off. So it kind of gives you an idea. It's broken into commission districts as well, so we wanted to show you what is in your district, if you had any questions on that. Typically, right now, we're not counting the Starbond, Village West, and Schlitterbahn. It's more of the, what was the word?
I just, maybe a couple comments on clarifying where they're at on the report that, as Charles just said, two things of this report. One is the Starbond area is not on here. It is a TIF district, though it's Starbonds. That is technically a TIF area, but we thought that would skew the report too much. The dollars of benefit that come in from that area are so overwhelmingly high that it would make the other numbers,
Right.
you know, it's kind of its own report by itself. The other one that is on here that's really different than any other TIF is the one for Midtown Indian Springs. That was a decision, and you can see we have an obligation to that report that we're paying for that property. We did the relocation of the school district within that area. Though that was done because we felt the need to move that forward, to get it redeveloped, to acquire the property when we did so. Unlike the other ones, it did not have a put-together redevelopment plan. So that was a conscious decision of the commission at the time to say, we're going to move forward, we're going to acquire Indian Springs, and we're going to use our TIF authority to do so. And at the time, we could use eminent domain to make that happen. And it was our intent to redevelop it, but we didn't have a redevelopment plan. So it's included here as a debt schedule as it works through it, but really in conjunction, when you consider your revenue to debt flow, I could make a good argument that you shouldn't count it here, you know, because it wasn't a decision you went through from a policy-making board and said, this is where we're going to deduct it. However, overall, when you see all of them, I mean, we definitely make more money off the revenues that are coming in all the TIF districts than we do pay out.
Wait, Doug, can you tell me how come you can make an argument that Midtown shouldn't be included in this?
Well, the discussion is more along the lines of policy decision as to why we do a TIF over a certain area. And as it went through, we typically do a TIF in conjunction with a redevelopment project that's ready to move forward. So you go through it, and we did a feasibility study for this, but we also knew we weren't ready to move on it all at the same time. All these other projects you go through, you have the redevelopment plan, we're ready to go, like 39th and Rainbow. We had the developer lined up, ready to move on it, make it happen. So you had the revenues coming in at the same time. So I'm just saying, if you're evaluating this from a policy, that is not a normal one in how we would typically go through our process and decide. We did that because we wanted to get control of that property and put ourselves in a position to redevelop it. All the other ones are done to say, okay, now we've got this redevelopment and it's ready to move forward.
So
it
it-
helps if they understand that the law was changing on
Yeah,
That- that-
Gary's pointing out that in 2006, the eminent domain law was changing, and
That
we
created-
took advantage of this TIF legislation in June of 2006. It changed in July. So in order to use it for that, we had to do it that time. And it's a TIF. I'm not making an argument, it's not a TIF where it goes, but there was a different policy-making decision made in relation to it than all the rest of these TIFs.
So in other words, that it was not necessarily a redevelopment project that you would then use the vehicle of the TIF to help that happen. It was, we needed to get moving on this, and we have this vehicle of the TIF, and if we can bring this under our control, then we can go forward with a redevelopment project in the future.
Well, we're planning to do the redevelopment, we were working on that, but we were still in a very premature state, and obviously never made it happen as far as getting the redevelopment done.
Yeah, so, just so new commissioners know, this project happened before any of us were on the commission, with the exception of Mike Kane. The only remaining, what?
Let's blame him.
No, I just meant he's the only one remaining, but the reason I remember the details is because right after is when Mayor Holland and I came on as commissioners, and there were a couple of follow-up action items. That's how come I know a lot about the project. And clearly, to me, what was very clear is that the commission at the time decided to take on a development project that in their mind they thought would not be difficult to redevelop. That they spent $20 million, they bonded $20 million with no plan in mind at all, thinking that it would be relatively simple to develop. I know that because I was here. And it was clearly not so, because some of the history on that is this project's been out for RFP more than twice now?
Yeah, I believe this is our third round, fourth.
So 3 times this has gone out as an RFP to be redeveloped, and it hasn't worked out, to tell you how difficult it's been. So I just think, in fairness to the newer commissioners, they need to understand, just because we control the site doesn't mean anybody wants to develop it or put anything there. The other thing I think is interesting, this is great information when you just look at TIFs, and I think that's good to see what performs and what doesn't. And I loved it. I think it was George that said, we all live and learn. Everyone in this room and everyone everywhere else has made mistakes, and you learn from the mistakes you make, hopefully, and you try to make it better as you move forward. And I think I've seen that happen with the commission and our staff. But the other thing that concerns me about these TIF projects is that a number of these projects have additional government money in them beyond TIF and SID incentives. Some of them have millions of dollars of government money in them. And I think that it is a bit misleading when we just look at these projects from a TIF perspective. Now, if no one cares, then I just wanted you to know that. But if you care, then I just know that there are projects in here that have millions of dollars in other kinds of government funding that don't reflect the level of investment this government has made. So,
Brian.
Go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
I believe one of the reasons we're here tonight talking about this is that back in December, the commission was asked to renew our approval of TIF policy. And at that time, the policy, a short, sweet paragraph, not very much real direction in it. And it's good to hear that over time, the departments have tightened up their internal policies or maybe their informal policies. But for the sake of verifying that or documenting it, I think it would be really good to ask for some recommendations on modifications to the stated policy that we were asked to approve, so that we could incorporate some of those lessons learned and document, for lack of a better word, those new policies or new practices that you guys have instituted to sort of not continue to go down some of the roads that we don't want to go down anymore, so that the commission could revisit that policy and then sort of update it a little bit. So that's my first comment. Secondly, I would like to know what we can do, if anything. What is our recourse on some of these non-performing projects? Do we have any real recourse, or are we where we are forever? Might be a question for our legal department. I don't know.
Well, I guess my response would be, it would depend a little bit on if there was a development agreement in place, and if there were language that gave us some recourse on that agreement. If the project was strictly general obligation backing, and some of the residential TIFs, that was what was done. It was the most efficient way to finance it. It was with geo backing, and I think our objective would be just to, hopefully that project will improve in the long run. I don't think there's really any recourse. I think one step that's been taken is the NRA policy's been modified to allow the presence of an NRA in conjunction with a TIF to further stimulate the housing market and in those residential projects that may not be performing to the level that we had hoped for. Doug might have.
Well, I think Lou's right on from that standpoint. Those that we have recourse usually are ones that we have a requirement from the developer to come in and fund something in advance of us before we end up backing it. So we've taken any of those we have. Some of these, and that's probably a good exercise, because some of these are dated and go back before any of the staff members here were working in economic development. So, you know, to pull back into those agreements on some of the residential ones particularly, and see if there's anything within them that we can pull out that gives us some authority to do something with, would be a good exercise we could go through. And some of it may be reaching, but it may be an opportunity where we have to do something there, and, you know, have legal review that with us and see if we have any opportunities that don't seem readily apparent to us. And we'll take a look at that.
Thank you.
I just have a question in regards to the residential TIF projects. I noticed that there's, it says under feasibility studies, there's an adjustment. As a result, staff has since added a layer into the feasibility study that can account for slower than anticipated construction cycles. Are there any other red flags or markers that would lead us to steer away from particular residential TIF projects in the future?
I think probably one of the overriding factors that make residential TIFs a little more challenging is that when you take a commercial project, or let's say even like a multifamily project, you can really define the construction time frame. You know when the project's going to start, when it's completed, and you know when that increment's generated. When you go into, let's say, 100-lot subdivision, it becomes much more difficult to really truly project when that revenue is going to come in full force. And so I think to oversimplify it, taking a much more conservative approach to what the revenue generation is going to look like, number one, and then layering in the performance measures like we've done with like Escalade Heights in the past, where you started with conservative projections, but even to release those funds for reimbursement to the developer, you need to see some construction take place. So 5 warm white boxes or 10 warm white boxes before. So I think it's taking those lessons we've learned, but then layering in multiple levels of, I guess the best way we would call it maybe risk mitigation on our part in terms of bond financing or bond debt.
I'll also offer that probably, if you look at the dates of our residential TIFs, this really hasn't been an area that we found to be active proponents of coming in and saying we think TIF's a good tool. You know, there are a lot of things about stimulating residential growth that, particularly with the NRA piece of it, finding a way to do the infrastructure piece of this, maybe outside of TIF, particularly in the urban core area, is a better way. Because then you still have the tax rebate program to put on there as an incentive, because you got to get the homeowner to come into it. And that's why we have not been actively coming in and promoting it. And I'm not saying there's not the right case for it, and we don't really have a policy that says don't do it, but we just haven't found it to be the market that we find to be attractive for us to go after. And kind of an unseen, just, it's almost a counter to where you were at, Commissioner Margia, when you said there's some of these projects, and there's a couple where there's some public infrastructure in them that's not in this deal. One thing to note in these residential TIFs, a lot of this money does come for public infrastructure. You know, so I mean, it's like there's legacy improvements that we would have in these areas that over a 10 to 20 year period, we'd probably invest $8,000 to $10,000 per lot, per development in, just keeping it going. And that's all public infrastructure that's being offset by the TIF. Now, in some cases, the TIF's not paying for it, but there is a public benefit that comes back out of it too. But that, in case, really is the counter argument to doing a TIF for it. It's like, let's find a way for the public investment maybe to be there to incent the infrastructure that comes into it, and then let the tax be an abatement tool or a rebate tool through the NRA program to get the resident to come in and live in the area.
If I could maybe wrap up a little bit of it, because it sounds like we've come to several possible either conclusions or next steps. First of all, Commissioner Walters asked about options on non-performing TIFs. And Mr. Bach had said that you could just take a look at that. So would it be possible for staff to just brainstorm, are there options? And if the answer is no, then that's the report. But to give us a report at a future meeting on whether or not their brainstorming has yielded any options for moving forward and possibly mitigating some of the non-performing TIFs. That would be number one. Number two would be, we had in our packet tonight the policy that we approved that Commissioner Walters referenced from back in December. And it's true that in this policy, the first paragraph basically just defines TIF. The second paragraph pretty much just defines how it operates. And then the bullet points really are a listing of TIF eligible expenses. This is on the final page of that. There you go, the top of that page. And so I think if I interpret Commissioner Walters' desire correctly, it would be that we get some of these adjustments, some of these state-of-the-art as of today, some, even if it's a policy recommendation on your part, that it get worked into this, right, so that if there's, so that we maintain our institutional knowledge base and it's written down and it guides whoever picks up this policy in the future. Exactly. So if you currently are doing a more aggressive feasibility study, then maybe the policy say it's recommended that a very strong feasibility study be conducted prior to issuing any TIF, and that you try to codify some of the lessons learned and put it in the policy. Then we can bring that back and vote on that down the road. That's my number two. Number three would be, I had no concept, and I will just say this, how much infrastructure got factored into residential TIFs. That's just an amazing, and we're challenged across the whole city to replace, update, repair, renovate, whatever, all of the old infrastructure that we put in 60, 70, 80, more than 80 years ago. And I will just say that was a real eye-opener for me. And I agree with Mr. Bach that maybe it's time we started looking for different vehicles to replace that infrastructure and not saddle a development with all of those costs. Let the developer focus on the development. And then finally, Commissioner Murguia mentioned some government money beyond TIF that might be a component of some of those projects. And so I guess my two questions would be, would you like a report augmenting what we already got, showing those monies? And then just an open question is if you have any policy recommendations now or in the future that we might layer into this policy that we're going to update. And you don't feel compelled to answer right now. If you have an answer, that's fine, but that's just something that I want to put on the table for you.
So I do just have a comment and a little bit of a response to that. If the other commissioners feel that that would be useful to have that information, that would be fine. It would just make me mad all over again. So I don't want to put staff to work when I already know the answer.
Okay.
But I will tell you, when I was my first year as a commissioner, when I got that information, I was literally almost knocked off my feet by how much money was cash was pumped into some of these projects beyond the regular traditional incentive. And I don't want to get, digress too far off of this issue, but Jim really sort of framed this up for me by saying the whole reason this is here in front of us is we're trying to set policy in regard to TIFs. And TIFs have traditionally been used in more challenging areas for redevelopment. And as a person that dabbles in development, I don't want to see, what I don't like to see is because one or two people took an incentive or a development tool and it was used poorly, for it to go away or to be so cumbersome, no one else can do it. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So for me, I don't know how to do this, so I'm just thinking out loud, if you just bear with me here. I don't know how to make it happen either, and maybe it's too hard for staff to figure this out. But instead of putting lots of criteria and limitations on a TIF, maybe one of the things, maybe we do a little of that, and then maybe we also look at the person, or the entity, I should say, proposing using TIF and their capacity to do a TIF project. So I always think it's interesting when we've had developers who have more than one, because anybody can have a failed development, more than one failed development, come in front of us all the time and get money for other developments. I just think that's interesting. Not that people can't make mistakes or have, a bad situation, but when you're talking millions of dollars and then they come back and they're approved for additional money or a different type of incentive, I don't know. I've never been on that end of things. Luckily, the developments I've worked on have been good, and I haven't yet. I'm sure at some point something will not go right. So I don't know how to manage that. So that's sort of my 2 cents, that we don't keep, just what we talked about in other situations. If we keep doing business with the same people and expecting different results, we really want to look at that. So that would be a big thing when you're looking at policy. It's also got to be some piece in there of who we're doing business with.
Well, I think this has been a very illuminating report and a great discussion. Although it came up for discussion only, we do have a couple of action items that we're taking away, and we'll get updated on those. And so at some point down the road, we will consider an updated revision of the Economic Development Tools Policy, and specifically the TIF section.
Great. Absolutely. And this is maybe a comment in regard to TIFs that never actually start or move. A big one, if you look up there on the map, is number 29 up in the Walcott area, where we started a TIF district on that. We had a sports theme retail redevelopment project that was proposed. We moved forward, got the TIF district set up, but we never moved forward with any kind of plan. The developer went away. I think we probably should build into our policy guidelines, one, if we never, no expense, no revenue, that there's a cutoff period that a TIF just, expires.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's a great idea.
Now, and the flip side, I guess, is, or that I guess we bring it forward and ask whether we want to renew it. So maybe it's not an automatic. We probably need to look at that from a legal perspective, because when you create a TIF district, you create it for 20 years. So maybe it's not an automatic expiration that comes in, that it's something that actually sets out that if there's no activity on it, then we will bring it back to the governing body for consideration to terminate it. And that way it's built into that agreement, and it probably has to be structured something like that. I don't think you can have an automatic expiration on it. It has to be
Yeah,
tied to a formal action where it would come back before the governing body. But, you know, some of them just carry on, you know, just like that, it's just sitting there, or, you know, we talked about Turner Woods earlier, that's one that was started and moved forward on, but we never took any action on it, and it just sits out there. And then you get into questions with the developer or the subsequent developer or landowner of it, what's their right to that TIF after it's changed hands a couple of times.
Yeah, I actually asked the question of bond counsel last week about Walcott, because I really wasn't certain of the status of it, and they said we would have to formally terminate it, the same as the procedure that we went through when we had, we terminated several TIFs that we had generated sufficient revenue, that were strong performers, and that we were able to terminate them early. We would take the same steps with Walcott. There's actually a little TIF increment that's been generated since that district was created. I think it's just simply due to that the assessed value of the vacant land might have had a slight increase in value since the onset, or, so, I don't know, I think that's a good suggestion for the policy, and we may want to look at these TIFs that we haven't had any action, and do we want to actually go ahead and terminate those?
So that could be part of our policy revision then, that under certain circumstances, staff may recommend terminating a TIF and bring that recommendation forward to commission. Great discussion, great report. Thank you to everyone who worked on this. This is good information, and I think it ultimately helps us make better decisions going forward, and that's what we, Mr. Brockman.
Thank you, Commissioner. What about, just to throw out there, a TIF that is doing townhomes or so, but the economy is saying townhomes are not, you know, not feasible right now, single-family homes? Would that be another part of the policy where we can come in and say, well, you know, the TIF is not, we got these 6 townhomes or whatever, it's not doing well, let's have an opportunity to change it to single-family homes instead of just dissolving it?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's addressed in the TIF statute, because anytime you make changes to a plan, you have to generate a new feasibility study, and so all those types of changes would have to come before you as a governing body for public discussion on that, so. But that, yeah, that doesn't diminish that a lot of times we find as we go years into a project that we need to make a substantial change like that, so.
And that just brings up one question for me. If we are guided by certain statutes outside of ourselves, and you just referenced that one, I don't know if it'd be helpful to reference that statute in our internal policy to say that in addition to anything internal that we create, we are also bound by and follow statutes at the state or what, federal level, whatever it might be. That might be, to make it just a more well-rounded policy. Any other comments? Any other discussion? Thanks to everyone for your cooperation in tolerating our juggered schedule tonight. We are adjourned.